What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to America Trends. Larry Rifkin and John Krofsick, and we hope that you enjoy all that we're doing on the podcast. And we like to surprise people, John.
This is certainly a surprise podcast because I was surprised by this story.
Well, first of all, did you realize that the largest IPO in history is soon going to be unveiled?
I didn't know that until I heard, but now I know it.
Now, by the way,
amazing.
folks, an IPO is an initial public offering. Now, that's what it stands for. Another way you can look at it is if it's a company you've always liked, but they were privately held and now they're putting out stock, then you can buy an interest in them.
Right, they're public.
Yeah, they're public, and that means that their reporting has to be different, and it changes a lot about their relationship with money markets and the like. Well, there has been a very closely held company, John, that we've all heard about over the years, and many salivated over it years back. But today we're trying to wean ourselves off the product that they offer, but I don't know that we're really doing a terribly good job of that.
I don't
but
think so.
I'll tell you what it is, John. Before I give you the actual company name, let's go back to Jeb and the Beverly Hillbillies. Can you roll that theme for us, John?
Let me tell you a story about a man named Jed.
Let's play the real version.
Come and listen to my story about a man named Jed. A poor mountaineer barely kept his family fed. And then one day he was shooting at some food, and up through the ground come a bubbling crude oil, that is, black gold, Texas tea. Well, the first thing you know, old Jed's a millionaire. The kinfolk said, Jed, move away from there. Said, California is the place you ought to be. So they loaded up the truck and they moved to Beverly Hills, that is, swimming pools, movie stars.
The Beverly Hillbillies.
Now, even the Beverly Hillbillies knew how valuable oil was, right, John?
They sure did.
You remember
Jed's
that?
a millionaire.
Yahoo! How about Mr. Drysdale? And oh, my goodness. Well, later this year, the Saudis are going to be selling a fraction of their family-owned Saudi Aramco to a world market, and it's likely to be valued. Are you sitting down, John?
I am.
And I know you can count this high because I did a test once. $2 trillion.
Trillion. Oof.
Now, the fascinating
unbelievable.
story about Saudi Arabia is how it began, this little family operation, how it took on territorial expansion and interest over time, and how smart they were in dealing with Americans who owned Standard Oil, and they didn't know what they had gushing under the ground. Just like Jeb, they didn't really know what they had there until the Americans came and said, well, let's dig here and dig there. And finally, I forgot what number it was, but they found a particular well, and they kept digging and digging, and all of a sudden, woo!
Gusher.
Black gold. There it was. So, in her new book, Dr. Ellen Wald walks us through the hot sands of Saudi Arabia to finally explain to me and to you, John, what's up with this country. How was it formed? How were they so smart in getting their entire oil business back from their greedy American partners?
Well, you know what amazes me about this story is that really the things I know about Saudi Arabia came at 9/11 because 9 of the 11 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. So, I didn't realize that we had worked so close with the Saudis.
And by the way, there are still a lot of questions about what role the royal family played in all of that. And I don't think that issue is by any way put to bed. In fact, there's still an ongoing lawsuit about that, and they are being sued. And I remember when we had Gerald Posner on our radio program, who wrote a great book about the keys to the kingdom and understanding this kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And these royal princes, they all were dying very mysteriously after 9/11 because of their role. And I remember one who died of thirst. Do you remember that story?
Yeah, I remember there was a lot of strange stories came out of Saudi Arabia.
Well, you can die of thirst, though, in the desert, I would imagine.
You can.
I mean, that makes
they
some
left you
sense.
on the beach with no water. Hey.
But this particular story is about how the Saudis, in part, stole back the oil company that we rightfully stole from them many years ago.
Right. Well, and this is it's a good story, and I didn't realize that we had worked so closely with the Saudis. So
yeah, there's a
this is an
more
eye-opener.
sympathetic tinge to this story than I would have imagined. And the book is called Saudi Inc. for a purpose. It is because they are very, very smart business people. We're going to learn a lot about them in advance of this IPO, which is coming later in the year. So once again, we're just a little bit ahead of the curve, and we like to be there, John, always on America Trends. On the line with us is Dr. Ellen Wald. The book is called Saudi Inc., The Arabian Kingdom's Pursuit of Profit and Power. And if we could, Dr. Wald, why don't you give us a little bit of that early history of looking to reinstate their ancestral home and the way that Riyadh really became the center and the capital of Saudi Arabia?
Sure. Well, it all began when Abdul Aziz ibn Saud, who was the son of his father had ruled Riyadh previously, but had been kicked out by this rival clan called the Rashidis. And so he actually grew up as a refugee in Kuwait. And one day, he was a young man, he decided to take his band of brothers and his cousins and some other local Bedouins who joined with him, and they all got together and they decided to attack Riyadh. They were going to try to recapture it from their enemies. And it was a very sneaky attack. They had kind of a spy in the city filling them in on where the weaknesses were and what the governor's schedule was like. And in the dark of night, they crept in. They had to climb over the walls, and they snuck in and attacked and defeated the governor. It was quite a sword battle, and took some personal hits there, but they defeated the Rashidi governor, and at the end of the day, Abdul Aziz had reconquered the city of his youth, and that was the start, really, of his quest to go out and conquer the rest of Saudi Arabia.
Now, for those who might romanticize Lawrence of Arabia and the British interest in his work, explain who he was in relation to the family you're talking about.
Lawrence of Arabia was really hanging out on the other side of Saudi Arabia. There were really two major powers by the time World War I was approaching in that area. There was Abdulaziz ibn Saud in Riyadh, which was on the eastern side of Saudi Arabia, and then there was Sharif Hussein of Mecca, who controlled Mecca, which was the religious center of the Islamic world, and he was more on the western side. And so when the British were looking for allies in the Arab world, they sent Lawrence of Arabia out to kind of feel out the situation. And so he ended up with Sharif Hussein of Mecca and decided, this is a guy who's really got what it takes. I think we should ally with him. Meanwhile, on the other side, you had Harry St. John Bridger Philby, who was also working for the British government, and he made a very strong case for siding with Abdulaziz ibn Saud. However, the British went with Lawrence of Arabia, and that's how we got the whole story of the grand story of their battles to defeat the Ottoman Empire. But in the end, it turned out that Abdulaziz was the stronger one because right after World War II, he went and he took his forces and basically wiped out Sharif Hussein of Mecca, kicked him out, and consolidated his control over the entire peninsula.
So when we hear of the lineage and we see the new dashing crown prince of Saudi Arabia today, we have to recognize that this is the lineage that comes from Abdul Aziz.
the crown prince is his grandson, and I'm told by Saudis that one of the reasons that they were so interested in putting him in the line of succession is because he bears a, quote, striking resemblance to the original king.
Very interesting. Well, as we look at this, you say to us that the oil history of Saudi Arabia and the political history are one and the same. We have to understand them both in relation to each other.
Yes, we do need to understand that the Saudis have always been about profit and power. And the best way to do that for them was with the oil industry. And so they've always been intertwined very deeply with this oil industry.
When we go back and we look at Standard Oil of Southern California as their initial partner, bring us through those early days, because I think your book does such a wonderful job of explaining all of this and letting us know that there was no certainty that there was any oil reserve under the ground in Saudi Arabia, and there was a lot of skepticism about it at the beginning.
This is a big misnomer that we always knew there was oil in Saudi Arabia. In fact, for a long time, no one thought there was oil there. The British had kind of given up on the area, and for a long time, people were uninterested in even looking for oil in Saudi Arabia, even though right nearby in Iran and in Iraq, they'd already found oil. And Standard Oil of California, which today is Chevron, was out in Bahrain. And Bahrain is this tiny island in the Persian Gulf that's very, very close to Saudi Arabia. It's connected today by a causeway. And they were developing oil resources in Bahrain when one of the geologists, Bahrain is a very small, flat island, but there's a little dome, it's not that little, around where they had discovered oil. And he would climb up on top of that kind of hill and look out across the water to Saudi Arabia. And he noticed some very similar formations along the coastline there. And he believed or thought that there might very well be oil there too. And so he made his case to the company, and they agreed, and they sent out, despite the fact no one had found oil before, they sent out the president to go negotiate with the head of Saudi Arabia, with the king and his advisors. And in 1933, which was just 1 year after Abdulaziz had consolidated control over the kingdom, they signed a concession, which basically was Standard Oil of California paid Saudi Arabia for the right to exclusively look for oil in his kingdom. And it took them until 1938 to find oil. And they tried drilling in that area, the Dammam Dome area, didn't find anything. So then they sent geologists out to scour the desert in the empty quarter. And there are these geologists trekking out there on camels and trucks with Bedouin guides looking for these old fossils. They didn't find anything. Finally, in the end, the oil was exactly where they thought it was. They just had to drill a little deeper than they thought.
Well, well number 7 plays a really important role in the history of the world, really. And they had to go deeper in 1938, and finally it started to gush. But they were about ready to give up.
They were. In fact, apparently the management in San Francisco had made the decision to give up when then they received word that oil had been discovered in commercial quantities. They had discovered some small bits of oil before, but it hadn't been enough to really justify continuing the project. But once they drilled that well number 7 just deep enough, suddenly it gushed and they knew they were in business.
Okay, so they were getting royalties, and that was okay at the beginning, but I wonder if we were thinking, these American entrepreneurs, that these are a bunch of rubes with whom we're dealing, and we can get the better of them. We've got all the sophistication and so forth. But you point out in your book that these Saudis were very, very astute and were really good businessmen in many ways.
They were very savvy businessmen. And a lot of it comes from this way that they negotiate. They knew what their strengths were. They knew what their weaknesses were. They weren't modernized. They didn't have formal education. They knew that they couldn't build the oil industry themselves. That wasn't something that they were capable of doing at that time. But they did know that they owned the oil. And if they went about it in the right way, they could maximize the value of that oil. So what they ended up doing was they ended up basically pushing the Americans and negotiating with them constantly to get more out of their concession. And the Saudis ended up being the first Middle Eastern country to get a 50-50 profit-sharing deal, where they received 50% of the profits from the oil industry, which was something that was new to the Middle East. Only Venezuela had that kind of deal before the Saudis.
How important was it for them to get a better deal? Because I know Abdul Aziz wanted finer things for his family, but he was very wise, I think, politically, because he wanted to get better things for his populace so that they wouldn't rebel against all the finery that the family was receiving.
That's exactly right. Part of what Abdulaziz wanted to do, and he was initially concerned about this. He wanted to modernize Saudi Arabia. He was concerned about the fact his people were very traditional, but he knew that they needed hospitals and they needed roads and they needed ports and airports and hotels. And so they wanted to use that money. They used it to build themselves lots of fancy palaces, but they also used it and put it to use in modernizing the country and developing their country.
Interesting that the king was not against the U.S. supporting Israel, even though they were in great partnership with U.S. companies and the U.S. government. But he did warn that he thought the Jews would want, quote, more living space. I mean, tell us about the relationship in 1948. And then, of course, I think it was 1950 when that 50-50 deal took effect.
Yeah, this is a big thing with regards to Saudi Arabia, this relationship with Israel, because most people have assumed that the Saudis were opposed to Israel, that they supported the other Arabs in their fight against the establishment of the State of Israel. And outwardly, the Saudis did just that. But when things got down to it, between the ambassador to the United States, the ambassador from the United States, and Abdul Aziz, when it really got down to it, Abdul Aziz said, look, we are not going to have that much of a problem with you guys supporting the State of Israel. In fact, we're not really all that concerned about Jews living in Palestine. We just don't want them to expand beyond that area and maybe come into our territory. That was really his biggest concern. But as for what they were doing over there, as long as it was contained, Abdulaziz didn't see a reason to really be concerned about that. He was much more concerned with developing his oil industry and ruling his country.
Does that give us a little bit of a picture of what's going on today, where it seems as if back channel Saudi Arabia and Israel are working more closely together, particularly because they have a common enemy in Iran?
It does. And part of that, I think, does come from the fact that the Saudis tend to be very pragmatic in their dealings. We see this in their business dealings, but we also see that they really prioritize profit over ideology and over other things. And so if they can ally with another country, even if it is Israel, or they can work together to combat a mutual enemy, then they're going to do that.
I think a lot of us wonder who really built Saudi Arabia into the country they are. Obviously, the revenue transformed Saudi Arabia, but the king gave America pretty wide berth to build in certain parts of the country because of the infrastructure that was needed to build this jointly held, at one time, oil company.
Yeah, the king he really wanted to prioritize that oil industry, and so he gave basically free rein to the Americans in Dhahran, where the oil industry was, to basically build their own little America. And when I was there, I saw it with my own eyes. It looks just like any other American suburb. Houses, streets, roads, everything looks like it could be, California. And that was a very important thing for Abdulaziz, was that the Americans should be left alone and develop this oil industry, because he knew that was how he was going to get money. And one of the interesting things is that Saudis in the region who grew up there, many of them, came from very poor families, but the Americans needed workers, and so they trained the Saudis in all kinds of positions. And as time went on, they educated them, sent them to schools, even in the United States. Many of them were given scholarships to study engineering, geology, all sorts of things that the company would need. And so some of these Saudis grew up in this basically American town of Dhahran, and many of them return to work for the company today. And so when you go there and you speak to people, it's very much like being in an American company.
Dr. Ellen Wald is our guest. The book is called Saudi, Inc., The Arabian Kingdom's Pursuit of Profit and Power, and it's called a timely masterpiece by Steve Forbes. When you look at it, there were some American companies that did not work so well with the Saudis, like Bechtel.
That's a really interesting issue because Bechtel had a hard time working with the Saudis at first. In particular, there was one incident where there was one project manager whose wife really couldn't control her alcohol consumption, and it started to be a problem for them, and they actually had him reassigned, mostly because his wife was a drunk, and she was saying things that she really shouldn't be saying. But ultimately, Bechtel had some issues with the Saudis in terms of payments and things like that, and were at one point kicked out of the kingdom. But the relationship didn't end there because Bechtel knew that they could make a lot of money off of the Saudis. And eventually, when things calmed down, Bechtel did return to the kingdom and is actually still a major contractor there today. Bechtel has built the Jubail Industrial City, which is this incredible complex of petrochemical plants and desalinization plants. And today they're contracted to build subways and transit systems as well.
Now, you tell us that with Aramco and the Saudis, first they were using Saudi workers for positions in the trades, the various things that needed to get done. But then they really started looking at management, engineering, law, and they started sending a lot of their promising young people to America to study at our higher education institutions. Tell us about the change that was taking place over what period of time where the control was really starting to move to the Saudis.
This really took place largely in the 60s and 70s, and by the 80s, Saudis were basically in top positions of management, vice presidents, and that sort. And in the 80s, the Saudis completed their purchase of the company. And once that happened, Saudis really started to move up in management even more. And I had the chance to speak to some of these individuals when I was in Saudi Arabia who were really first-generation Aramcons, they call themselves, who had come from nothing. I mean, the poverty that they described growing up in, no shoes, no health care whatsoever, couldn't read. And they came and they educated themselves. They went to high school at night while working labor jobs, and they really rose through the ranks. I talked to one gentleman who was basically like the second in command during the Gulf War. And it's really incredible to see the progress that was made during that period of time.
We'll return to this episode of America Trends in just a moment. If you like what we're doing here at America Trends Podcast, please don't keep it to yourself. I know there are a lot of people, John, who think, well, if I'm listening and somebody else wants to listen at the same time, maybe we're going to collide and they're not going to be able to hear us. Yeah. Is that the way the technology works?
No, there's plenty of bandwidth. Everybody can listen at the same time.
All right. Well, that dispels that myth. Now, you can do a number of things that would really be helpful to us. You could give us a kind rating or a review at Apple Podcasts, and that boosts what they consider to be our value and visibility. And what does that do, John?
Well, that puts us in the forefront so that you can find us easier, and most important is other people can find us easier.
And you can subscribe there or on our site, americatrendspodcast.com, or wherever you're listening, so we can alert you to new episodes of the podcast, which, by the way, we put out twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Or you can like us on Facebook or follow us where, John?
On Twitter.
On Twitter, that's right, where the world turns to hear fake news or whatever it is. Well, you can direct message us at Trends Podcast or using hashtag Trends Podcast. And John, with our growing audience, and really it's been pretty remarkable, a lot of people just came to us the last month or two, and they might have missed earlier episodes. Can they get them again?
They can look through them and pick the ones they want to listen to. They're all on the website, and a lot of them are up on iTunes, many of them.
All right. Well, listen, there's lots of material to listen to. We hope you have the time, and we'll lend it to us because we try to make it worth your while. And thanks so much for listening.
And tell your friends.
We now return to this episode of America Trends.
And when did they determine that they really needed to take control of this company? And I know that Americans in business with them were very worried about nationalization, which went on elsewhere. How would you describe the slow burn of this process? Because you say sometimes the Saudis assume full control almost immediately after buying or importing what they lacked, and sometimes the process took nearly 50 years. So when were they patient? When were they impatient? And when did they really decide that they needed this gift from God that was in the ground to be theirs to extract and to benefit from fully?
The process did take quite some time. And the reason was because they didn't want to disrupt any of the processes that were profitable for them. Again, it's this idea of they're smart, savvy business people. And they saw what happened in Iran when Iran nationalized its oil industry without having the capability to really run it as it should be run. And they didn't want to make that mistake. And so they waited, they bided their time. There was actually one Saudi oil minister who really advocated taking control of the company much earlier, and he was actually fired in part because of his very nationalistic statements. And when the time came in the 1970s, right around that time, it became clear that oil prices were really too low for the market conditions that they were existing in. And they were having a lot of difficulty negotiating with oil companies to raise those prices. And that was definitely part of the impetus for the Saudis to start, to start buying out the company. And they negotiated with the Americans. It was maybe not the most amicable negotiation, but it was a negotiation, and they negotiated to buy a percentage of the company. And then, again, they had more negotiations after the 1973 oil shocks. It became clear to the Americans at a certain point that they were not going to be able to maintain control of this oil company, that the resources really did belong to the Saudis, and that the Saudis would need to assume control of the company as well. And the Americans wisely chose to continue with this negotiation process, and they did receive what I believe at the time was called market value for the company. We don't know how much they paid. I've asked a bunch of people who were there, and none of them would tell me. So we don't really know how much the Saudis paid for Aramco, but we do know that they paid, and it was an amicable process. And multiple people who I talked to who were working there told me that after the buyout happened, they didn't notice any change. There was no change in how the company functioned. And that was the Saudis' goal. They wanted to own it, but they didn't want to disrupt the money-making process.
Very interesting. And they also said that they didn't want to use oil as a political tool. Put in context for us that shock that you talked about in the 70s, and then OPEC and the oil embargo. Put all of that in context for us.
This is a big misnomer, is this idea that Arabs use oil as a political weapon, that they can use their control over oil resources to get what they want politically. And there are some countries that definitely do this and advocate doing this. But Saudi Arabia was always much more cautious. In fact, its oil minister said at the time, we don't want to mix politics and oil, essentially. And they did not want to use oil for a political goal. And when it came time to the Yom Kippur War in 1973, there were several Arab countries who very much wanted to embargo oil supplies to the United States because the U.S. was arming Israel. And they wanted to do that kind of as a retaliation. And the Saudis went along with it. There were definitely strong sentiments about the war from the king. However, what I found out was that was not the Saudis' number one motivation at all. One of the reasons they needed to raise oil prices and also the embargo was because oil prices were way too low in the early 70s for the market conditions, and so they wanted to raise them. But if you just willy-nilly raise oil prices on someone, it looks very capricious. So for the Saudis, this political conflict was almost like a cover for a economic decision that they felt needed to happen. And in fact, in negotiations with OPEC that took place after the initial embargo, when they were deciding on what kind of oil price they should settle on, the Saudis argued very strongly for a lower oil price than the Iranians and the Iraqis wanted, because they were concerned that if they pushed prices up too high, it would, first of all, dampen demand, so their countries wouldn't be buying as much oil, and it would also help spur other oil investments around the globe. And that is actually what happened. It contributed to a movement towards energy conservation in the United States, towards the drilling for oil in Alaska and in the North Slope. So one of the things that we see is that the Saudis were looking at kind of a larger picture of what was going on, and they acted accordingly. But I think because of the way that the 73 oil crisis has been perceived in the United States, we don't really realize that they were making a business decision and not a political one.
Well, going forward a bit, if you go to the early 1990s, Saudi Aramco helped to stabilize the world oil markets in the context of Desert Storm. I mean, what was our relationship with them during that period? And then going forward, of course, all the disruption and the concerns about 9/11, their role, whether in fact the religious element of the Saudi kingdom was getting in the way of some of their business interests. Give us a framework for all of that.
When it comes to the Gulf War, Aramco played a crucial role, and I think we may not be quite as cognizant of what kind of role it played. Leading up to the Gulf War, in fact, Aramco had been producing less and less oil, mostly because it was trying to play this swing producer in OPEC and produce less oil to keep prices elevated. But once the Gulf War started, Iraq's oil was basically off the table, and oil prices just shot up. And the Saudis felt that they needed to do something about it, and so they started to produce more oil. And in fact, once the military operation was agreed to, Aramco provided all of the oil and gasoline and other products that the American forces and the coalition forces needed in that area. So they were really providing all that oil. And then after the Gulf War, Saddam Hussein created these gigantic oil spills in the Persian Gulf. And one of the things that Aramco did was it participated in, and in large part almost very significantly participated in cleaning up those oil spills. And not only did they clean them up, but they were able to kind of corral the oil into certain places in the Persian Gulf where they could basically pick it up, scoop it up, clean it, and then put it on the market. And so they were very influential in preventing a greater environmental disaster from occurring in the aftermath of the Gulf War.
So if we go up to 9/11 and we go to their complicity in 9/11 and what that did to the relationship, business and otherwise, with the United States, how would you describe that?
The Saudis didn't really know what hit them when it came to 9/11. They had no idea, I think, for quite some time, how Osama bin Laden felt about them in particular, because Osama bin Laden was very against the United States, but he was also directing a lot of his ire at Saudi Arabia, and there were terrorist incidents in Saudi Arabia as well, particularly against the royal family. One of the reasons he felt that the Saudi royal family was not appropriately respecting Islam. He felt that they were false rulers. And so they realized, I think, after 9/11, how deeply this ideology was being felt in their region. And as a result, they did pull away, in a sense, from the United States. In fact, during the second Iraq War, the Saudis allowed the United States to use their base in Saudi Arabia to bomb Iraq. But after that, they said, the base is going to close. We're no longer going to host you. And that is what led to the United States moving its air base to nearby Qatar. And the Saudis really struggled with this. And eventually, I think they came to the realization that they needed to fight terrorism because terrorism was bad for business. Terrorism globally, terrorism in their country, Islamic fundamentalism, it wanted to overthrow their family just as much as they wanted to hurt Americans or Westerners. And once they embraced this idea that terrorism was really bad for them and for business, they began to really crack down on fundamentalist mosques and preachers who were stirring up trouble within the kingdom.
I know your book goes up to 2015 and King Solomon and so forth, but now there are a lot of other efforts going on, social liberalization under the Crown Prince, this Vision 2030, the Aramco initial public offering, which is likely to be the largest in history. So how would you typify what is going on in terms of politics in Saudi Arabia today and their relationship to the United States, which we see as being presented in a very positive light in terms of these meetings at the highest levels. But how would you describe it?
The Saudis are trying very hard to modernize their economy. Part of what Mohammed bin Salman's plan is, or part of his fear, in a sense, is that he's going to become king, and he will be king when the oil runs out. If you look at their reserves, they have enough, if they keep producing at this rate, don't discover any more, for about 70 years. And he could very well be king then, and that could be a very, very big problem for him. And so he's starting early. He sees this as a very, very imminent issue. And so that's why he's starting to try to diversify their economy, to create new industries, so that Saudis will find employment in these new industries. They're looking at logistics, data centers, entertainment, all different sectors, defense manufacturing, in fact. And that's part of his huge push to diversify the kingdom, but socially as well. And I think part of this is also tied to this idea that they're smart business people. They realize that they can't do business with the rest of the world if they have a country where women can't drive and women have difficulty working alongside men, that this is part of what's driving them to make changes. And they want their population to be happy as well. And over time, a large portion of their population has received Western educations, and a lot of people are very positive about the social liberalizations, and it makes them happier. And for the prince, they don't vote. There's no public opinion polling, but he's giving them what he thinks they want, and it seems to be working.
And what about the IPO for Aramco? A lot of people very interested in it. I know they're bringing over a lot of American talent to help them publicize this. How big an event is this going to be, and when is it going to occur?
Well, your guess is as good as mine when it comes to when it's going to occur, because the decision will ultimately be made by Aramco and the Saudi royal family. So we don't know when the IPO will happen. It will happen when they're ready. They say everything is on track, and it'll be a decision that's made for when is best in the market. But when it does come time for this IPO, we are looking at a potential valuation of up to $2 trillion, and that would be so far and beyond the largest IPO to date. And they're only going to look to IPO to sell about 5%, which, if they get $2 trillion, would give them $100 billion. And it can't really underscore how huge this is. They've hired many, many bankers to go over their finances. This is a company that has never had to file the kinds of disclosures or adhere to any kinds of regulations like other companies, say, in the United States that want to IPO. So it's a massive amount of work to be done. Now, the company's always been run very much like an American company because it has these roots in its American companies. So I think that they find that they are very similar. It's just that they've never really had to adhere to the same regulations.
In closing, with America becoming an exporter of oil, what is the change in the relationship as a result of our newfound strength in an area that has been dominated by the Middle East and Saudi Arabia in particular?
This is an incredible thing for the United States that we're now an oil exporter. And for the Saudis, they do not see U.S. oil exports as a threat. They see it as a business opportunity. In fact, one of the recent cargoes that came out from the ports in the Gulf was picked up by a Saudi ship and was brought to China. So here you have American oil being put into a Saudi tanker and taken halfway around the world to China. And that's the global oil industry. And the Saudis are more than happy to make money at any point of that oil industry, whether it's drilling the oil or transporting the oil or refining it.
What an incredible romp you have given us today in terms of looking at the history of Saudi Inc. Dr. Ellen Wald, the Arabian Kingdom's Pursuit of Profit and Power. I thank you so much for being part of America Trends today.
Thank you. I had a wonderful time.